Draft card burning was a symbol of protest performed by thousands of young American men and women as part of the opposition to involvement of the United States in the Vietnam War. Beginning in May 1964, some activists burned their draft cards at anti-war rallies and demonstrations. By May 1965, it was happening with greater frequency. A draft card is a notice sent by the U.S. government to tell a military draftee that he must report for duty. The Selective Service Act was passed in 1917, forcing men of certain age to register for the draft. Any man turning 20 years of age on the date pulled from the first barrel would have to report for duty, with the second number indicating in what order he would go. The lower the number, the sooner he would have to report for duty. With 27 million men of draft age during the war, nearly 9 million enlisted. Only 2.2 million of the remaining 18 million were drafted. 700,000 refused induction or deserted once they were in the service. According to the government figures, which are generally conservative, more than 500,000 men and women were classified as deserters. On October 15, 1965, David J. Miller spoke briefly to the crowd from atop a sound truck before burning his draft card at a rally held near the Armed Forces Induction Center on Whitehall Street in Manhattan. Miller was arrested by the FBI 3 days later in Manchester, New Hampshire, while setting up peace literature on a table. The 24-year-old pacifist member of the Catholic Worker Movement became the first U.S. war protester to burn his draft card in direct violation at the first man convicted under 1965 amendment. The act had already required all eligible men to carry the certificate at all times and prohibited alteration that would perpetrate a forgery or fraud. The 1965 amendment, however, made it a separate crime under 50 U.S.C. 462b3 to knowingly destroy or knowingly mutilate the card.
In April 1966, Miller was sentenced to 30 months in prison. The case is argued in the United States Court of Appeals, and Miller's attorney held that, quote, symbolic speech is protected by the First Amendment. Burning draft card is the most dramatic form of communication, and there is a constitutional right to make one's speech as effective as possible. The court did not agree. Miller remained free on bail until June 1968, at which time he served 22 months in a federal prison. Subsequently, 46 men were indicted for burning their draft cards at various rallies, and 4 major court cases were heard. One of them, United States v. O'Brien, was argued before the Supreme Court. On the morning of March 31, 1966, David Paul O'Brien and 3 companions burned their draft cards on the steps of the South Boston courthouse in front of a crowd that included several FBI agents. He explained that he burned the draft card publicly as a form of symbolic speech to persuade others to oppose the war, quote, so that other people would reevaluate their positions with the Selective Service, with the armed forces, and reevaluate their place in culture today, to hopefully consider my position. O'Brien's previous sentence of 6 years was upheld, and the act of draft card burning was defended as a symbolic form of free speech, a constitutional right guaranteed by the First Amendment. About 1,000 draft cards were turned in on April 3, 1968, in a nationwide protest organized by the mob. In Boston, 15,000 protesters watched 235 men turn in their draft cards. War protesters were increasingly choosing the more profound act of turning in their draft cards, an act which gave the government the name and address of the protester. Burning the draft card destroyed the evidence, and by this time was seen as less courageous. From 1965 to 1973, very few men in the U.S. were convicted of burning their draft cards. Some 25,000 others went unpunished. The image of draft card burning was a powerful one. influential in American politics and culture. It appeared in magazines, newspapers, and on television, signaling a political divide between those who backed the U.S. government and its military goals, and those who were against any U.S. involvement in Vietnam.
Many in America were not happy with the draft card burners or the frequent depiction of them in the media. Justice Garrett, national commander of the Veterans of Foreign Wars, spoke against what he saw as too much news coverage. All of our young people are not burning up their draft cards. All of our young people are not tearing up the flag. All of our youth are not supporting North Vietnam and carrying Viet Cong flags. In October 1967, at a rally in support of the government's a news photograph was snapped of a man kissing his draft card, his girlfriend smiling at his side. In Playboy's November 1967 issue, Playboy Playmate Kaya Christensen wrote that her turn-offs were hypocrites and draft card burners. Later that year, leftist Ramparts magazine showed 4 draft cards being burned on the December 1967 cover. That Saturday evening, Post, a conservative publication, put an image of a draft card burning on their cover, January 27, 1968. In 1967 off-Broadway and 1968 on Broadway and in London's West End, the musical Hair featured a climatic scene in Act 1 of a group of men in a hippie tribe burning their draft cards while the main character Cloud struggles with the decision to join them. President Johnson spoke strongly against the draft card protesters, saying in October 1967 that he wanted the anti-draft movement and get investigated for communist influences. Reporting on his reaction, the New York Times presented that the protests as being against the draft rather than the war. Richard Nixon ran for president in 1968 on a platform based partly on putting an end to the draft in order to undercut protesters making use of the symbolic act. As president, Nixon ended the draft in 1973 and draft cards became obsolete when the U.S. military was changed to an all-volunteer system, rendering a necessary symbolic act of draft card burning. Despite this, men of a certain age are still required by law to register with the Selective Service or risk of becoming eligible for certain government benefits, especially student loans.